who built his first car in 1896, was unique among automobile inventors, not only because he sought to build a car for the masses, but because he wanted to build one that was the lowest priced. It wasn't until he developed the wildly successful Model T that Ford began experimenting with available production techniques. By 1908, the nation was on the move, and Ford's need for production speed was paramount.
You have to understand the context in which the assembly line took place at Ford. From the time that the Model T was introduced, the Ford Motor Company could not meet the demand for Model Ts.
And his goal was never to create the assembly line. His goal was to constantly improve production to drive the price of his car down, but also keep the quality up and keep the production volume going up. And he pursued this goal relentlessly.
Ford regularly rearranged men and machines to improve the speed of stationary component assembly. In 1910, Ford opened the 60-acre Highland Park plant and set up the machinery on the shop floor in the actual sequence of automobile production. This radical departure from the more conventional grouping of machines by type enabled workers to deliver parts more efficiently to each sub-assembly station.
He was averaging a doubling of production for several years before the assembly line. But this relentless drive for ever more production at ever lower cost led him almost inexorably to the techniques that eventually developed into the assembly line.
Ford then made the giant step of moving the car instead of the worker, based on the principles of Frederick "Speedy" Taylor. As the first authority in industrial efficiency, Taylor's work was already popular in the steel industry.
It was his specific understanding that human intelligence, as applied by workers at the point of production, was a hindrance to efficient operation.
The principles were designed to break down a particular job into smaller and smaller tasks, which meant that much of the task could be controlled, mechanized, and thus speeded up. This process would require more men with less skills.
Effectively, he tailorized the work and took the skill out of the work process, dividing the labor, subdividing it again, so that a workman would do a smaller and smaller part of it. And doing the smaller and smaller piece of work, he could do it faster and faster.
In April of 1913, 29 highly skilled Ford employees stood next to each other alongside a component sub-assembly line. The line was composed of all the parts necessary to make a flywheel magneto. Rather than assemble the entire component by himself, each man performed a simple, narrowly defined task on the component and then passed the part on to the next guy.
Then they said that if this works with transmissions or it works with magnetos, what about engines? What about front axles? What about rear axles? And eventually they got all these sub-assemblies on the assembly line.
1 year later, after Ford had successfully assembled key car components on an assembly line basis, a Model T chassis was pulled by rope across the factory floor. Workers began picking up parts from carefully placed piles of sub-assembly parts and attaching them. When they were finished, they had assembled an entire car in only 5 hours and 50 minutes. The moving assembly line had cut the production time of the Model T in half.
Ford and Ford's engineers took all of these ideas and brought them all together and created what we think of as the modern assembly line. But it was really an amalgam of all sorts of other ideas, but nobody had ever tried to put them all together and use them to put together something as complicated as an automobile.
Fashioned after the conveyor belts used in slaughterhouses, Ford installed the first automatic conveyor belt to move the chassis down the line in a continuous flow. What used to take a man 728 hours to build could now be built on a moving assembly line in 90 minutes. Production soared dramatically from 82,000 cars in 1912 to a staggering 267,000 cars in 1914. With that, Ford dropped the price of the average Model T from $600 to $490.
The assembly line created for consumers a kind of abundance that the world had never seen.
The assembly line was a tremendous symbol of modernity, of productivity, of wealth.
By the late 20s, 43% of the world's goods were produced in America, as manufacturers of all kinds tried to emulate Henry Ford's assembly line technology.
If you can make something as complicated as an automobile on an assembly line, the reasoning goes that I ought to be able to make toasters and phonographs and other things which should be much simpler.
They look good, don't they? They taste good, too.
Ford's method of mass production, however, required mass consumption in order to maximize profit and minimize cost. That simple formula would ultimately prove to be the undoing of some early manufacturers. But that didn't stop any of them from applying the new assembly line technology.
There are new products coming on into the home, electrical appliances, which had been sort of experimented with at the turn of the century, but these were going in wholesale into American homes. You have companies like General Electric, Westinghouse that are beginning to make home appliances with moving line assembly.
The assembly line allowed not only more stuff to be made, but more complicated stuff, higher quality stuff, things like radios and phonographs, things that had once been fairly high-end. We talk about car companies so much in this assembly line context because really that's where the assembly line was perfected and grew up, and it's where it matured.
Ford's original assembly line was designed not so much to build cars as to build the Model T. But the Model T offered precious little choice to consumers and only came in one color, black. Sure, it was cheap, but now consumers wanted variety, and General Motors geared up to give it to them.
One of the things that General Motors realized was nobody was going to compete with Henry Ford directly on price. So the key was to make a car that cost a little more than a Ford, but offered more than a Ford. And that's really where they tried to target the Chevrolet.
What you see in the assembly line, in terms of engineering the assembly line, is essentially working out methods by which you can have greater variety.
By 1926, Ford had lost 25% of the market share to General Motors. Post-war Japan reconstructs the assembly line.
I think you could say that Henry Ford invented the assembly line for the car and that Toyota perfected it.
After World War II, U.S. productivity was said to be 8 times greater than that of Japan, which was ravaged by depression and inflation.
The Toyota situation in the post-war period back in the early 50s, they really had nothing in terms of resources. It was a resource-poor country. They had no opportunity to waste. Any materials they had to somehow use.
In 1950, E.G. Toyoda, then a young Japanese engineer hoping to rebuild his family's business, spent 3 months at the Rouge Complex, the most efficient car manufacturing facility in the world. Unlike many manufacturers at that time, Henry Ford was unafraid to share the unprecedented scale of his assembly line techniques with other industrialists.
Ford's assembly line worked great when you had high volume and low variety, hopefully no variety, just one. But Toyota's situation was different.
At that time, Toyota Motor Company was making 1,000 cars a month, while the Rouge was making 1,000 cars a day. And that wasn't Toyota's only problem.
Here they are making 1,000 cars per month. And all those, they had to make all kinds of cars. They had to make trucks, big cars, big cars, little cars, limousines, fire engines, you name it. They had to make everything for the Japanese market.
It's necessity that compels the Japanese to redefine the responsibilities of labor in a system that is starved for capital and is only serving very low volumes of demand.
Unlike the highly mechanized assembly lines developed in Detroit, Toyota built their assembly lines around their primary resource, which was labor.
And to do that, they realized the most flexible thing in the entire operation are people. Not machines, not anything else, it's people.
The Japanese never went as far down this road towards making the worker merely a cog in the machine as we did. They were actually using their workers' mind power, and we had forgotten about that.
In what was considered a fundamental change in the assembly line technique, Toyota reorganized the work, reduced the waste, and let the workers define their responsibilities in a process called lean manufacturing.
Every job that you see on a Toyota assembly line has been slowly and steadily improved and fine-tuned over the years by every operator who's done those jobs. Toyota managed to involve the workers, to engage the workers, and to give them jobs that actually provide more fulfillment on the assembly line.
Not only were workers required to define and improve their jobs, they were given a variety of jobs to perform.
They do low-end maintenance. They do low-end housekeeping. That means that you have much less support staff in the factory. You have fewer material handlers. You have fewer janitors. You have fewer maintenance personnel. You have fewer inspectors.
Toyota said the operators, the plant floor, is in charge of quality. If you have a problem, you stop the line right now.
With that, every worker on the assembly line became an inspector. Quality and productivity increased because assemblers were able to make more parts right the first time.
The productivity tends to be higher in a lean production plant because you are obligating workers to take on tasks which previously would have been carried out by indirect support staff.
Toyota also did away with certain specialists on the assembly line, like die changers. A die is a hard piece of metal in the exact shape sheet metal assumes after pounding. Toyota developed a simple die change technique on rollers that allowed workers to change dies in 2 to 3 hours instead of the 2 or 3 weeks it took at American auto plants.
They didn't know exactly what number of different products they were going to be making every day, so they had to be prepared to make those every single day.
The Toyota assembly line required that its workers be skilled, motivated, and innovative, because once production was established, the workers were responsible for continued improvement, a process they call Kaizen.
You would remove 10% of the workers, 10% of the time, 10% of the resources that backed up that process, and force the remaining workers to figure out how to now get that job done with 90% of what they had before. And so that would be Kaizen. That would be the continuous improvement element of it. Once they had reestablished a certain balance, then you take out 10% again. And you continually ratchet downward the resources available. That is what makes it lean, because you have only the bare minimum necessary to get the job done, and you keep pressing it downward to see what you can achieve in the way of maximum efficiency in terms of productivity.
By the 70s, Toyota's assembly lines were well suited to capitalize on the changing demands of American consumers for smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. A severe shortage of oil caught American automakers with millions of larger gas-guzzling models on their assembly lines.
There were a lot of people that knew that there were serious problems in the way we were building cars here in this country for a long time. It's quite natural the way that developed. There was a huge market. The system that Ford came up with worked very, very well.
In 1980, Japan surpassed America in auto production, and Detroit reluctantly conceded. Toyota's lean assembly line method proved to be an innovative and efficient production technique. By 1989, the Japanese were making cars in half the time and with half as many defects as those made in the United States. For the second time in the 20th century, the automobile industry changed our basic ideas of how we make things. Henry Ford's mass production gave way to Toyota's lean production, an assembly line method that ultimately shifted the balance